Chapter 7. Chase in the Park. There were tense and fearful moments as the plane descended at a quick rate toward the sea. All passengers were strapped in and put their heads in their laps, awaiting the crash. But the pilot was skillful. He managed to touch the water lightly, then lifted the craft so it bounced along the shoreline like a stone being tossed across the water. He finally managed to land safely, and no one was injured. Relieved, the passengers aboard began to talk excitedly. Mr. and Mrs. Misay congratulated Nancy and her father for having remained so calm. "I can see that you are experienced travelers," Mr. Misay said, as the seaplane floated tranquilly to a dock. "Good thing we didn't crash," Mr. Drew said, "or the pearl-making oysters here would have gotten a dreadful scare." The others laughed. Then Mr. Misay asked the pilot what had gone wrong and translated the answer. "He feels that someone tampered with the engines. After a complete examination, he will let us know." Mr. Drew said he would appreciate this, as his group intended to fly back to Tokyo that same day. Meanwhile, we'll tour the Pearl Farm. A guide took the visitors ashore in a boat, showing them the long bamboo rafts that contained the oyster beds. "The oysters hang from the rafts in wire mesh or plastic baskets," he explained. "They feed on plankton and must be cleaned from time to time. We have a crew here that inspects the beds daily. The men must keep an eye on worn or broken ropes and inspect the oysters for disease." "Who injects the nuclei?" a white-haired Englishman asked. "That's done by young ladies called tamersan. Freely translated, this means Miss Pearl Pusher," the guard replied with a smile. The girls open the oysters carefully with a special tool. After the operation, the oysters are allowed to rest for a while in quiet waters about 17 feet deep. "It must be quite a shock to their systems," Nancy declared. "It is, and many eject the nucleus. We have X-ray equipment that tells us which oysters do, and we do not bother raising those." "I see some floating buoys way out there," Nancy remarked. "What are they for?" "Those are experimental glass fiber buoys, roughly 1 foot in diameter, which will eventually replace wooden or bamboo rafts because they are more durable and economical," the guide replied. "When are the pearls ready for harvesting?" Mr. Drew inquired. "They are beached after about 2 to 3 years. This takes place in the arid winter when the pearl sac cells have stopped secreting nacre and the top layer is completely crystallized." "I'll bet that's an exciting occasion," Nancy remarked. "Yes, indeed. The oysters are opened one by one with small knives, and out come pearls in many sizes and different qualities. About 20% cannot be used at all, and truly precious pearls are quite rare." "Can you produce a bigger pearl by inserting a larger nucleus?" a blonde woman asked. "Yes, but that is risky financially because large nuclei kill many oysters." "I feel sorry for the poor oysters," Nancy said. "For 2 to 3 years they are irritated by the foreign object inside them." "True," the guide admitted. "But then nature does the same thing. Man does not harm the oyster any more than nature does." When their tour was over, Nancy and her father spoke to the manager of the Pearl Farm and asked if Mrs. Tanya Rossmeyer had visited the Mikimoto farm. "No," he said, "and we have not heard from her. However, I will be glad to call you if Mrs. Rossmeyer should visit us." The Drews thanked the man and gave him the Misay's phone number, then joined the rest of the group for the return flight. The trip back to Tokyo was uneventful, and they reached the Misay's home in the evening. On the doorstep lay a note addressed to Nancy Drew. She opened it quickly and held her breath. The familiar 4 + 9 = 13 equation was the only message. Nancy showed it to the others, then said to her father, "It's not fair to put the Mises in any danger. I think you and I should leave here." "You mean go back to the United States?" her father asked. Before Nancy could reply, both Mr. and Mrs. Mises spoke up. They insisted that their guests stay with them. They were not afraid, and besides, they felt that they could give the Drews some protection. Anyway, the person who is sending these threats may forget the whole affair if we do not take him seriously. Meanwhile, I suggest that we get away from the house for more sightseeing, Mr. Mises said. Nancy and her father did not feel this way about it, but did not object to the idea. "What do you recommend?" Mr. Drew asked. "A trip to the famous Nara Park," Mr. Mises said. "It is a lovely place to visit and is full of interesting things to see." Mrs. Mises smiled. "Nancy, you will love the little deer that come out of the woods and greet tourists." "Isn't that quite a distance from here?" Nancy inquired. "Yes, about an hour's flight," Mr. Mises replied. "I will make the reservations right away." Next morning, they drove to the airport and departed for Nara. The town had been Japan's capital in the 8th century, preceding Kyoto and Tokyo. The visitors enjoyed the sights before continuing to the famous park, which was a spectacularly beautiful place. People crowded the entrance and chuckled at the small deer that clustered around them, bowing their heads in welcome. "Aren't they darling?" Nancy exclaimed. She patted several of the animals, who were very friendly, then followed the Mises on a walk along the paths that meandered among the trees. They finally came to an enormous statue of Buddha and gazed at it in awe. The benign figure had its right hand raised, as if blessing a congregation. Mr. Drew remarked that it must weigh an enormous amount. 500 tons, Mr. Mises said. The total height is 71.5 feet. The Buddha itself is 53 feet tall, and the face alone is 16 feet in height. "That really is tremendous," Nancy remarked. "When was it cast?" "In the year 749 AD. It contains several metals, but the outside is bronze." Nancy asked her host about the main tenets of Buddhism and its great teacher, Gautama Buddha. Mrs. Mises replied, "That suffering is inherent in life, and that one can be liberated from it by mental and moral self-purification." Nancy thought this over, then said, "If a person could do that, he would be perfect." "That is true," Mr. Mises said. "Many Buddhist priests try to attain this goal and deny themselves most of the pleasures of life. We, who are not priests, also try to accept pain and to live moral and upright lives." Nancy smiled. "You are such kind, helpful people. I am sure you're succeeding beautifully." The couple seemed embarrassed by the compliment and changed the subject. Nancy, meanwhile, had noticed how many people were taking photographs. Most of them were Japanese, but there was a sprinkling of visitors from countries all over the world. Suddenly, she saw a man who was snapping her picture. She stared at him and realized that he was short, had black hair, a hard face, and was wearing a gray suit. He looked to be of Italian descent. Could he possibly be Benny, the slippery one Caputi? When the man became aware that she had spotted him, he turned and hurried around the statue. Nancy took off after him, her camera ready to snap his picture. By the time she reached the rear of the great monument, the fugitive was running away at a fast clip. Nancy pursued him and was closing the distance between them when suddenly a guard stepped up and stopped her. "Please, you must not pursue an innocent man in this holy park," he said. Nancy was amazed. What made the guard think that the fleeing man was innocent? Certainly the fact that he was racing away made him highly suspect. She said, "I don't think that man is innocent. I believe he's wanted by the police." Suddenly, Nancy realized that the guard had spoken English without the slightest accent, and that he did not look Japanese. Was he a friend of Caputi's, and had he borrowed or stolen the Japanese guard's uniform? The girl decided to pay no attention to him and started to hurry off. He grabbed her by the shoulders. "Don't you dare run away," he hissed at her. End of chapter 7.